for coming back. This week, I'm going to focus a little bit more acutely on peak performance and what it means to perform and things we can do to help our performance in whatever domain that might be. Quickly, to review last week, I explored how the omnipresence of stress, it's a part of our lives and an inescapable part of our lives. And I believe that it's largely grounded in a distorted relationship to time. And what that means is that we forget about what really sustains us and what really matters to us. And that sense of connection that should be at the center of our lives drifts to the periphery. And we get stuck in the drift cycle of time scarcity, tyranny of the urgent, and then a preoccupation with the insignificant. And we blink and decades go by. And this cycle just unfolds. And so last week we looked at that process and potential ways we can interrupt it by scheduling connection into our lives, activities that connect us to the people, places, and activities that make us feel most alive. And I mentioned that the beginning and ending of each day seem to be prime times for connection. And that if you can prioritize connection at the beginning of the day, prioritize connection at the end of the day, it's a good way to bookend the day, and it helps us find value in everything that transpired in between. And so, like I said, this week, we're going to be looking at peak performance with the caveat that, like last week, I'm taking a ton of stuff and packing it into a short amount of time. So there will be a number of stops along the way that we could potentially pursue in much greater depth. But tonight is kind of just to give you an overview of the landscape. And if at any point you have a question or anything, feel free to jump in. I'm going to do my best. I did not do a very good job last week of finishing in time to allow for more questions. I will do my best to do that this week. Okay, so when we talk about peak performance, the ability to consistently execute at the upper limit of your capacity. It's a nice general definition. This is a good visual. We take two factors into consideration: your capacity and challenge, which is basically stress. And capacity can be physical capacity, it can be psychological capacity, it could be strategic capacity. If your capacity far exceeds your challenge, you're understimulated, or in the literature they call it low psychological arousal. You're bored, right? With my students or with athletes at the high school, I'll use the example of playing a basketball game where you're maybe against a younger sibling and in the driveway, and you're far superior than your younger sibling. Now, it might be cool for about 2 minutes to just be blocking every shot and dominating them, but it'll quickly get boring. Why? Because there's no challenge. Conversely, if there's too much challenge and not enough capacity, you're overwhelmed. And this is where we typically get really stressed. And so we're looking for that channel, that interface where capacity and challenge meet in a way where you're being pushed to test what you're actually capable of. And when we talk about peak performance, it's entering into a really unique space where you actually don't know if you have the capacity to succeed, but that excites you. And that's what makes peak performers so interesting, is that in that space, instead of leaning out, they lean in because they find that it reveals something about who they are, gives them insights into who they are. And they seem to be intrinsically, or not always intrinsically, that can be learned to enjoy failure. Peak performers typically really thrive with failure because it's feedback about how to improve capacity, what to do better. And so this model kind of guides a lot of the work I do with performance. It's actually my version of, I always mispronounce his name. I believe it's Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, who discovered flow theory, or came up with the idea of flow theory. He interviewed over 500 world-class performers, and he asked them from a phenomenological point of view, what's it like when you're performing at your best? And these were performers in every domain that you can imagine. And what he found is in their accounts of describing what they experience when they're performing at their best, that many of them use the imagery of water, of this sense of going with the flow, of being caught in the current of something larger than themselves, and it seemed effortless, that they were performing and executing at a high level, but it didn't feel like it was effortful. It felt very easy. And so he called this flow experience. And so that last graph is kind of, I've changed it a little bit, but it's based on his research. I look at performance in a continuum. You could dissect it and arrange it any way you want. I just find this to be useful. These are the different ways of responding to the pressure of performance. At the far left, you have choking. And we all have seen examples of choking. And this is when the moment is simply too big. It's too big, and we get lost in it, and we cannot access our capacity at all. And there are numerous examples of athletes. Very recently, do I need to go there? But also you could argue with the Alabama game, Alabama against Clemson. They didn't really seem to show up. The moment seemed very big, which was surprising for a lot of people. Then you have micro-choking, which is not full-on choking, but it's disruptions in your ability to access what you're capable of. And it might be intermittent throughout a contest or a performance, but it's there. It's these moments where rough spots in your performance. And then in the middle, you just have performing, right? Then thriving, and then peak performance at the top. And I would say your ability to consistently peak perform is mastery. Everyone can have a game or a performance where they peak perform, but to string peak performances together, so it's not just a one-off thing, I think that reveals some sort of mastery of craft that's very, very unusual. And because athletics provides so many easy examples, I'll go with athletics over and over again. There are a number of athletes who have extraordinary games. And there are even athletes who have extraordinary seasons. But there are not many athletes who have extraordinary careers, where they're able to continuously perform in that peak performance zone. Tom Brady would be a wonderful example. I mean, he just defies the normal curve of performance. And so today I'm going to use two kind of essential questions to frame what we're focusing on. One, am I ready to perform? Because the performance space is stressful, and you have to be ready to enter into that space. Because if you're not, that's not good. You have to be primed and ready to enter into that space, and we're going to talk about how we can assess that to know our level of readiness, and then how can I achieve and maintain peak performance. So once I'm in that space, I'm ready for it? I'm in it. What are some things, skills that we can develop to be in that space and to persist in that space? So first one, am I ready to perform? Peak performance hinges on your readiness for and ability to adapt to stress. I always think of Mr. House's third grade science class. Was it third grade? I think it was third grade. Fourth grade over at St. Mary's. We had to build balsa wood bridges. You guys remember this? Was this just an anomaly at St. Mary's? I thought this was a universal science experiment, yeah? And so you spent, all this time building a bridge out of balsa wood. And actually, I did it the night before, but we won't talk about that. And then there were 2 tables, and you would set the bridge across the table, and then he had a bucket with some sort of weight contraption. And there were certain specifications for the bridge so that it could hold this hinge for the weights. And in increments, he would put more and more weight on your bridge till you would start hearing the cracking and snapping, and then poof, in an instant, your bridge was done. I think this is a wonderful analogy for what happens when we push ourselves into the performance zone. What is the architecture, our inner architecture of mind, and how does it respond to increasing levels of pressure and weight? And when it breaks, one of the coolest things about the science project was you simply didn't just get rid of the bridge. You had to pick up the fragments and then try to assess, where did it give? Where did it break? And if you were to build it again, how would you redo it? And so I think this is the piece, again, going back to failure, where failure's so vital, because the inner architecture of your mind in the performance space, it's going to break, and that's okay. But once it breaks, are you just going to leave the pieces on the ground and walk away and then just blindly build a new bridge and hope for a different result? Or are you going to pick it up and examine it and then reassemble, figure out how to make it stronger? And so one way to do that is to look at the autonomic, what the research calls autonomic tone. This is looking at the nervous system, because this really indicates your readiness for stress. And if your nervous system is already in red alert all the time, and then you attempt to enter a performance space, it won't bode well for you. The autonomic nervous system is comprised of 2 separate systems, the parasympathetic and the sympathetic. Like this drag car, the car is like the sympathetic, and the parachutes are like the parasympathetic. So we have within our nervous system something that helps us go, fight, flight, freeze, or faint, survival, activity. And then we have another system that's the parachutes that slows us down. They say rest and digest, and that's the parasympathetic. Robert Sapolsky, who's I think he's an evolutionary biologist at Stanford, he wrote a wonderful book called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. And in the book, the thesis is basically that we are wonderfully adapted to acute stress. Lion comes to chase you, you're a zebra. You attempt to flee. Hopefully you're successful. If you are, you're back down to homeostasis within a few minutes, and you're just eating grass and going on with your life. And so our nervous system is adapted in this way, our stress response. What it is not adapted to do is to constantly be in, not quite red alert, but in yellow. Constantly in this low-level vigilant state, so that you're never relaxed. Sometimes you're getting into red, but you're almost always in yellow. And I always say to my students, raise your hand if you experience on a regular basis the phenomenon of being tired but wired. I'd say 90% of their hands go up, right? You're in bed, you're absolutely exhausted, and yet your mind is going a million miles per hour, and you wish you could just shut it off, calm down. You're so tired, but you can't sleep. You can't rest. You're in this vigilant background state. Your nervous system is active, and it doesn't know. The parachutes behind the car, they're frayed or non-existent, right? And the car is just going and going and going, and you just want it to stop. So zebras don't get ulcers because they don't have chronic stress. So we are, as a culture, in what's called sympathetic overdrive. The sympathetic nervous system is constantly going, and we cannot perform at our best while in sympathetic overdrive. And many athletes' careers are significantly shortened because they don't know this. They don't know how to activate this other side of training, of performance training, which is rest and recovery. And they're constantly go, 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 go. So we're going to look at 3 kind of domains of assessing readiness to take on the stress of performance, starting with the psychological. 1, and there are all sorts of assessments, research-based assessments that you can use. I'm mentioning them here, but there are several different assessments for each one of these things. So level of perceived readiness, just asking someone on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being you are like a bowl in the pen ready to go, that's 10, okay? Or 1, you just want to run the other way. You can't even deal with whatever it is you're about to do. So asking someone, what's your level of perceived readiness? That's a wonderful indicator, right? So if you're a coach or a teacher or even a parent, that's just quick feedback. Where are you at? Give me some feedback. You get a 5, 6, 8, whatever. Might be a good conversation for juniors and seniors going to college, right? College is its own kind of performance. What's your level of readiness? Mood scale. Harvard has a wonderful mood scale assessment that looks at just where people are at in terms of their relationship to their emotions. And this is a wonderful lens or precursor for future outcomes and performance. When people rate that their mood is very low, they tend not to perform as well, which is not surprising. Emotional reactivity test. I'm sorry, this is actually the Harvard test, is the emotional reactivity test. This one looks at how you respond to emotionally charged situations, which is, again, symptomatic of high sympathetic activity. And then creativity and imagination. When people are rested, their imagination and their ability to be creative is up and running. And this is actually in the literature on trauma, something that's really interesting, is that they know people who have experienced trauma and have PTSD of some kind, that they're turning a corner for the better when they start being able to access creativity and imagination. And they've done fMRI imaging on PTSD, and the part of the brain where people can imagine things and be creative is completely shut off. And when that is turned back on, all sorts of wonderful things happen because people can start to imagine their life being something other than what it's been or what the trauma's been. So people who, on a less serious scale, people who are rested, I mean, just think about it. If you go through a couple nights and you got really good sleep, you're feeling good, your mind is able to entertain all sorts of possibilities and do things that you just typically can't do when you're overtired. Then we look at neuromuscular cues for, is someone ready to perform? Something as simple as a grip test. This is what they often do with athletes in the morning. There's all sorts of devices where you can measure grip strength. And so you create a baseline every morning. And what they've found is that when athletes wake up, upon waking, weakened grip is an indicator of overtraining. And so a lot of protocols will have people scale back on their training when they wake up and their grip is weak. Because your nervous system is still processing a lot of information from training. Tap test. I believe you can download tap tests on your phone. And it gives you like 10 seconds, and you hit your screen as many times as you can in 10 seconds. Seems ridiculous, but again, it's your sympathetic nervous system. It's revealing how taxed it is. Reaction test. How quickly can you react to some sort of stimulus? I'm forgetting the name. I saw this machine. One of my brothers is a kickboxer, and he does MMA fighting and jiu-jitsu and all this stuff. And they have this machine where it's got a line of lights, and then it crosses, and then one that goes like that, and you sit in front of this thing, and as soon as and you can see everything within your immediate and peripheral vision, and when a light pops up, you have to hit it immediately, and it times your reaction time. And so it goes in these patterns, and you have to keep up with it speeding up. The purpose of this, one, it's improving eye-hand coordination and reaction time, but two, it's also used as a diagnostic for overtraining. You can create a baseline doing it, and as your times slow down, again, that's indicative of high sympathetic activity. Neurophysiological things. If you take your heart rate at rest or usually upon waking, if you have an elevated resting heart rate, you should relax. Right? Don't push yourself. You're not in a place to be pushed. Heart rate variability has become something in athletics, but it doesn't just have to be athletics. It's become often used, kind of became the gold standard, and within the last 2 years or so, they're finding that maybe it's not as reliable as they thought. But what heart rate variability is if you are rested and in good cardiovascular condition, your heartbeats should vary. The window in between heartbeats shouldn't be constant. There should be variability. Ba-bum, 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 ba-bum. It shouldn't be ba-bum, 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 ba-bum. If you lack heart rate variability, that's a sign of overtraining or too much stress. Wearable technology now, there's Whoop. Has anyone heard of Whoop or use Whoop? It's just a watch, you can wear it, and what it does is it takes your heart rate variability the last 5 minutes before you wake up. It knows when you wake up. And so then when you wake up, you look at it, and it tells you, are you actually rested? Are you in a state where you should go and push yourself? Or should you take it easy? Sleep quality. How many of you wake up in the morning and just feel wonderful? Just want to take on the day, right? This is a very simple metric. When you wake up, do you feel rested? And if you don't, that is, I'm getting a lot of looks. Swami Tommy's looking at me like, are you crazy, man? You want to talk about your sleep? Sleep quality, not only duration, but quality of it and consistency of it. Do you go to bed and wake up at the same time? Are the conditions of your sleep optimal? What sleep researchers say is that you shouldn't see your hand a foot in front of your face in your room. So the level of darkness should be that dark that you can't see your hand. Now, you think this is just overstating the obvious or whatever. There's a lady named Sherry Ma at, I think, University of San Francisco. She's a sleep researcher. She was hired by the NBA and the NFL. This is amazing. They gave her this schedule, the total schedule for the NBA season and the NFL season. She knows nothing about either. She doesn't know players or teams or who's good, who's not. Just based on travel schedule, she identified high-risk games for disruptions of sleep and recovery for both seasons, NFL and NBA. She predicted with 78 and 80% accuracy who would win those games, essentially knowing nothing else, just by identifying travel across time zones. And I forgot what it was. There's one, I think it's west to east, or is it east to west? One of them, it's the teams lose. I forgot what the percentage was, but it's remarkable, right? So sleep cannot be, the importance of sleep cannot be overstated. Mouth breathing is a huge sign of sympathetic dominance. Breathing through your mouth all the time. Sleeping and waking up and having a very dry mouth. Okay? It is often tied to CO2 intolerance, which is carbon dioxide. Right? Carbon dioxide is emitted from your body when you exhale. And there's actually a CO2 tolerance test that we can do right now that might be the best easy test to gauge your level of stress. You ready? Are you ready?
Yes, I'm ready.
Am I putting everyone to sleep? Sit up straight. You're going to need to take out your phones to time this. Open up your stopwatch. No updating your social media while we're doing this. Just kidding. Okay. What we're going to do is breathe only through the nose. Mouth is closed. You're going to breathe. You can take a full breath in the nose and then exhale out the nose. Breathe in the nose, out the nose, in the nose, third time, out the nose. Fourth time, in the nose. Then you're going to release the air, exhale, from your nose as slowly as possible. As soon as you start to exhale, start that timer. So let me explain it one more time. Breathe in your nose, out your nose 3 times. On the 4th time, breathe in your nose. As soon as you start to exhale out your nose, slow your exhalation down as long as you can, and you're timing it, that last 4th exhalation. If it becomes intermittent, that you stop it. So you're like trying to get every little bit of air out. That doesn't count, right? So stop it if you get to that point. Can you what? Sure. So just natural full, I would say natural full breaths. So I'll let you do it on your own. 3 in, 3 out, 4th one in, time the exhalation out. No mouths open. Still going? Got some Olympic level exhalers here. Okay. Raise your hand if you were under 20 seconds. Raise your hand if you were between 20 and 40 seconds. Raise your hand if you were between 40 and 60 seconds. Raise your hand if you were 60 to 80 seconds or above 80. Okay. Under 20, this is an assessment used by Brian McKenzie. He trains Olympic and professional athletes, and he's done work with Stanford. This is called a CO2 tolerance test. If you are under 20, you are in a state of high sympathetic overdrive. You have a lot of stress. You are stressed. Your system is stressed out. And when you exhale, exhalations are driven by the parasympathetic nervous system. If you have a weak parasympathetic impulse, it's very hard for you to extend that exhalation because of the sympathetic dominance, right? What he recommends with his athletes is that if you are under 20, start to do that exercise every day until you're consistently above 20. 20 to 40 is very average. 40 to 60 is pretty good. 60 to 80 is advanced, and 80 and above is like you are highly, highly trained. No one naturally gets above 80. That's something you really have to train to do. Other things you can do to improve CO2 intolerance is, if any of you are runners, you can work on running at a pace and going as aggressively as you can without mouth breathing. So as soon as you have to breathe through your mouth, scale back. I've finally gotten to the point I have a treadmill at home. I can run 6 miles per hour all through my nose, which is 10-minute mile. And that's taken me a while to get to that. I was awful at first. I'm a total mouth breather. And so that's one thing you can do is exercise or walk or just pay attention throughout the day. For the most part, you should be breathing through your nose. It helps regulate everything. So sympathetic dominance, most of us are very stressed out, and we're not identifying that we're necessarily in that state and doing the things to shift out of it. One thing that's really, really, really important, having grown up in Lake Forest, teaching in Lake Forest, we're really good at recognizing that we're stressed, seeing all the dead-end roadsides signs, and just putting our heads down and barreling forward. Grit is not doing that. And there's this myth of just just put your head down and barrel forward. And as my grandfather always used to say to us, there's no such thing as a free lunch. When you do that, you might get away with it once. You might get away with, I say this to my students all the time, staying up all night to study for something or finish a paper. You might get away with it once. But that's not a sustainable strategy. And it comes at a long-term cost. And the more you do it, the more you're burning yourself out on the back end. And when we talk about that peak performance zone, your ability to return back to it again and again and again, when you take this approach, you get burned out. And you're going to compromise your ability to return to that space and persist in it. And it's funny, I think athletes, out of necessity, today understand this much better, and they struggle with it because by design they want to push, they want to be at that upper threshold. But I think athletes are more skilled at listening to the signs of overtraining than your typical person. And especially in when I've done work in corporate environments, etc., that's sometimes the worst environment in terms of recognizing just being too stressed and learning to step back and relax. So how do we restore autonomic balance? Sleep, duration, quality, and consistency. Last week's presentation, slow down, schedule connection. One of the most parasympathetically activating activities is just meaningfully connecting with people you care about. Pets, even. They've done studies on people just petting a dog. Lowers their blood pressure, lowers their heart rate, right? There is all sorts of breath work that you can do, breathing techniques to improve your parasympathetic nervous system and to calm you down. And then mindfulness, which is going to be a huge piece in part 2. Mindfulness is, in my opinion, like the perfect activity for if you're a high sympathetic type of person. Mindfulness is about the best restorative activity I think that you can practice. So, part 2, sorry, I'm jumping ahead. How do I achieve and maintain peak performance? So the first part was just looking at, are we ready to get into the performance space? Okay, so let's assume that we are. You've taken care of the things that we just talked about. You're more rested, you learn how to recover better, and you're ready to take it to the next step. Mindfulness, I think, is the keystone skill here. The process and practice of paying open attention to the details of the present moment. Mindfulness disrupts automaticity and reactivity. I'll explain that in a second. And it also activates the parasympathetic nervous system. What I mean by disrupts automaticity and reactivity is that by design, to some extent, arguably, our brains want to be an automatic pilot. We want to go with the momentum of tendency. It's easy to do that. Unfortunately, if you're going with the flow, you're typically going somewhere you don't want to go in the long term. You're going downstream. And so mindfulness is a wonderful practice of disrupting that automaticity so that you can actually start experiencing what is so often overlooked, which is the immediate details of your present experience that we're constantly jumping ahead of as our minds run on to whatever it is they're fixating on. And then disrupts reactivity. And we'll talk more about this in a second. I'll just go to it. Dan Siegel, who's a psychologist, psychiatrist, and an MD, he uses this hand model of the brain. So if you put your hand up like this, put your thumb in, put your fingers over, tilt it forward, you've got a working model of the brain. Right? You've got your limbic system, you've got the cortex, brainstem, and then most importantly, the prefrontal cortex and the medial prefrontal cortex, which is right here. This is the part of our brains that was the most recent to evolve. It's the center of all our executive functioning. It's what makes us most distinctly human. It's the first part of our brain to go offline when we get stressed. So there's this paradox. It's the most important piece of evolutionary hardware that we have, and it's the most susceptible to stress. And so when you look at this hand-brain model, what we see is two areas of concern for performance and well-being. The amygdala, which is down here, and the posterior cingulate cortex. A hyperactive amygdala is what makes you feel tightness in your chest. It's what makes your heartbeat feel abnormal when you're stressed out. It's what makes you feel edgy and highly reactive. And what's interesting about the amygdala is that it has access to controlling your behavior through all sorts of neurochemicals that bypasses sensory processing. Which means, and we've all experienced this, you're walking through a room or somewhere and you think in the corner of your eye you see something, like a snake or an animal or something, and it scares you and you jump. And then you turn and you look and you realize it's just the cord to your lamp. That's the genius of your amygdala. It's made to make you react before you've actually processed what you're experiencing. So it's been a highly valuable piece of our brains until now, right? And going back to what I was saying before about chronic stress is one of the things that's constantly signaling all sorts of neurochemical stress responses is the amygdala. And mindfulness helps downregulate the amygdala. And there's an inverse relationship between amygdala activity and prefrontal cortex activity. And I won't get into this too much, but it's called bottom-up regulation versus top-down regulation. Everything we know about human well-being via fMRI imaging connected to subjective reports. So someone says they're experiencing well-being, they rate themselves on a subjective test, they throw them in an fMRI scanner, which shows in real time which parts of the brains are active. And what they've found by doing this is that when people report high levels of well-being, low amygdala activation and high prefrontal cortex activation, which is called top-down regulation. So we want this online, and it down-regulates our lower brain. Mindfulness helps us do this. Mindfulness practice. The other part that is very important is the posterior cingulate cortex. Jumping ahead. So when they've put people in scanners and given them nothing specific to focus on, every person ever scanned, a certain part of your brain, they're called the midline structures of your brain, it's called the default mode network. It lights up. And what people report when the default mode network lights up is that they start thinking about themselves in the past and the future. And there's one particular place that houses almost all narrative thinking. It's called self-referential processing, and that's the posterior cingulate cortex. Why am I telling you all of this? The more active your posterior cingulate cortex is, the less happy you are and the less engaged you are. And people who have chronic depression, deep depression, have highly active posterior cingulate cortexes. And they often, they're starting to often describe depression as a rumination disease. You get stuck in rumination cycles. And then you ruminate thinking you're going to get out of the ruminating, which leads you further into the ruminating. And then it's like quicksand of the mind. And this is when they scan people who are in this state, the posterior cingulate cortex is lit up. What they found with mindfulness is that it downregulates the posterior cingulate cortex. Why? Because mindfulness is the practice of paying attention to present moment. Posterior cingulate cortex is rumination about the past and the future. So if you are someone whose thought patterns are constantly playing tennis between the past and then going to the future and then going to the past and then going to the future, and the present moment is just this like incidental net in the middle, you're someone who has a very active posterior cingulate cortex. Now, there are pathological levels of this, and then there's just also, everyone has this, which is why this is how they actually discovered it. I think his name is Damasio, and he wrote a paper in 2001, and he was the first to identify in all these different images, when people weren't given a specific task, everyone's brain looked the same. He saw these structures in the middle light up. It's fascinating. So there's an inverse relationship between self-referential processing and engagement and well-being. How am I doing for time?
25 minutes till.
Okay.
I don't care about time anymore. I learned that last week.
Yes.
But just,
You're in the present.
yes.
You're beyond your self-referential processing. I should have brought a gold star for you. This is worth mentioning. Self-talk. Albert Bandura has been studying, he's at Stanford, he's been studying the concept of self-efficacy for like 40 years, 50 years. He's 90-something years old. Just wrote his most recent book a few years ago. Super sharp. What his research on self-efficacy has suggested is that negative self-talk is connected to poor performance. Positive self-talk is not connected to high performance. And I think this is so important because so many coaches, be it a life coach, a performance coach, a teacher, even as parents or mentors, you say, well, just think positive thoughts, right? It doesn't work. It doesn't work. And as one researcher, I'm trying to remember his name, he said the lower brain emotional centers sniff out your bullshit. It's verbatim what he said. That and there's some evidence to suggest that the linguistic parts of your brain aren't directly connected to the emotional parts of your brain. So you can't activate language to downregulate like specific emotions. It doesn't work that way, right? And this is why someone who's chronically depressed can't just say to themselves, "You're not sad, you're happy," right? It doesn't work like that. And so I think what the research does suggest is that self-talk is more like the canary in the coal mine. It's revealing and symptomatic of underlying processes that need to be attended to and managed. But if you go to the self-talk itself and try to manipulate it, it's mistaking symptoms and causes. And it's trying to make the symptom into a cause for some sort of positive effect. It doesn't work. Which is why when I work with athletes, I had an awesome experience with a particular athlete at Lake Forest College this past fall. He had performance anxiety. His position was very important. And he said to me, well, how do I'm jumping ahead a little bit. How do I talk myself out of being anxious? I said, whoa, you don't talk yourself out of anything. You're not responsible for what you think or feel. You're only responsible for what you do. And when I said that, it was like someone took bricks out of a backpack he was wearing. It's like, so I don't have to spend my time trying to create a certain mindset. I said, no, you don't have to spend any time trying to create any kind of state. Just focus on what you need to do, the procedural things you need to do, and execute your attention on those things. And coexist with your thoughts and feelings, whether they're positive or negative. And the more you're able to execute and pay attention to what you need to do from a procedural standpoint, the less likely negative thinking will intrude in that process, right? And so I can't emphasize enough that self-talk is not the way to go. Yes?
How does that tie into when people say, come up with your gratitude list? Think about, what you're grateful for in terms of trying to shift how you look at life.
So my take on this is that the words represent where attention is. And so when you name certain things to be grateful for, you're leveraging attention onto those things. So it's the shift of attention that's causing some sort of transformation. It's not the actual linguistic aspect of it. The language is just a tool. See what I'm saying? And so it's the command of attention, which I'm going to talk about in a second, that I think is really the underlying fundamental skill. Quickly, we're good? This is awesome. This is 2008 Olympics. Lolo Jones. I don't know if any of you know her. Who was an amazing 100-meter hurdle sprinter. This is her narrative account of the medal race. When the gun went off, the Australian girl got out on me. She beat me to the third hurdle. You know, I was cool and calm about it. She had been doing that all year, and I would always get her in the end. Sure enough, I passed her, and from hurdles 3 through 5, I was just in an amazing rhythm. I started turning it over, and then I knew at one point I was winning. The race, it wasn't like, oh, I'm winning the Olympic gold medal. It just seemed like another race. And then there was a point after that where I was like, wow, these hurdles are coming up really, really fast. You have to make sure you don't get sloppy in your technique. I was telling myself to make sure my legs were snapping out, so I over-tried. I tightened up a bit too much. That's when I hit the hurdle. Honestly, I shouldn't have relaxed. I should have relaxed a little bit and just run. Instead, I was just so paranoid because they were coming up so fast, I snapped it down too fast. You know, when I hit it, I thought I would still be able to get a medal. But when I crossed the line, I knew how bad it was. I collapsed on the track and I couldn't stop thinking. I just wish the next Olympics were tomorrow. In this narrative account, you get a very common experience, a description of a very common experience for performers and athletes. And that is being totally absorbed in the activity and in flow and performing at a high level, and then cognitively that posterior cingulate cortex switches on and you step out of the actual activity and you start evaluating it as an external observer. When you do that, you are not performing at the same level because your mind is divided. And so you have to be able to stay out of your head. It's a trap. And when you're performing at this level and a couple hundredths of a second determine a gold medal and obscurity, the slightest shift in attentional focus and execution can mean the difference between being forever a gold medalist and not medaling at all. This is a performer / athlete who, in my opinion, and not just my opinion, is the opposite. He is the best in the world and arguably as good as anyone ever at commanding attention. This is Alex Honnold. He's a free solo climber. He just recently climbed El Capitan, 3,000 vertical feet with no equipment. He's unbelievable. And I've watched a ton of his stuff where he's talking about his process. In one of the climbs where he was building up to El Cap, I think it was Half Dome, he had a panic attack. He had a panic attack 1,500 feet off the ground. And to calm himself down, he finds this ledge that's about this big, and his friend is climbing and filming him next to him, and he just scoots out on this ledge, and he just stares out into valley, semi-valley, and then he kind of scoots back, and he's like, "Wow, that was close." Says something to the camera guy, like, "Whoo, okay, let's go." And then he gets back on and he goes up. They've done research on his brain. They've fMRI scanned him. He has exceptional control of down-regulating his amygdala. And what's fascinating with a climber like that is that you can't be too calm. Free solo climbers, there aren't many in the world. The ones who have died climbing, all of them have died climbing familiar routes. None of them have died climbing a new, innovative route. So it's that false sense of comfort and relaxation. So they have to find this, it's like turning dials. They have to find this balance between being too amped up and too sedated. Because either one could mean, one wrong hold. when I watch his climbs, they just had a film on him in IMAX, which was incredible. But I mean, I almost had a panic attack just watching it. So one of the things we can do, and I assign this to athletes I work with, is I have them start doing a thought inventory. And this is just practical mindfulness. Is Michael Pollan, who is a journalist, he's written a lot about food. One of the cool things he said about food or grocery stores is if you go into a grocery store and you look around, you think you have this amazing diversity of food, and in reality, it's just like 3 or 4 ingredients packaged thousands of different ways. And so when I work with athletes, I have them take a thought inventory, start recording your thinking throughout the day. Do it for a week. And it's the same thing as the grocery store. You think you have this amazing diversity of thought, but in reality, you have like a few thought ingredients that are just packaged hundreds or thousands of different ways that you're just creating. And when you can stop and just start observing how these processes, these thought processes play out, you can trace your way back down to a few kind of archetypal thoughts that guide how you perceive the world, how you feel about the world, how you respond to the world, what your expectations are of the world. And I think the research suggests this, and I think you see this in meditative traditions. To some extent, this is an oversimplification, but I don't think entirely. There's 2 types of thoughts. Thoughts that narrow and close, thoughts that open. And what that is I think that is the evolutionary roots of pessimism and optimism. Pessimism is thinking that closes off. It's protective. It's defensive. Thoughts that open are optimistic. It's seeing possibilities. Right? So if there's difficulty, you see opportunity. Opportunity to test your capacity. Opportunity to try something new. To learn. But if you're in pessimistic modes of thinking and you're stuck, you're going to see adversity and say, that's a threat, I need to go the other way. Well, it's hard to actualize your potential if you're constantly defensive. And so one way is just doing a thought inventory. It's a wonderful initial mindfulness exercise. What are the thoughts you're married to on a day-to-day basis? And do you realize how much attention and energy and validation you give them unconsciously? You just assume that they're true. What if they weren't? How would your performance change? How would your capacity change if you started to question some of your fundamental thinking patterns? You must get rid of negative... so this is a big misperception. You must get rid of negative thoughts and feelings and replace them with positive thoughts and feelings. So after I have folks do this, often their response will be, okay, I identified I have a lot of negative thought patterns. So now I just replace them with positive thought patterns and amp myself up and that'll be good. And it's like, no, it's not exactly how it works. Again, I just mentioned this because I had gotten ahead, but you're not responsible for your thoughts and feelings. And this is so big. You're responsible for your actions. I can't tell you how transformative understanding this is. When you think you're responsible for every thought that goes through your head and every emotional state that moves through you, you're going to be fighting with something that can't be contained. It can't be managed directly. And it's going to make you feel increasingly incompetent. It's going to make you feel increasingly anxious because it's going to elude your control. And ultimately, it's a waste of time because at the end of the day, Alex Honnold could stand at the bottom of El Cap and think and feel all sorts of awesome thoughts. He can imagine climbing to the top. He can imagine being on the cover of every climbing magazine and having a documentary made about him, all that stuff. Does any of that matter unless actually physically performs and climbs El Capitan. And so we sometimes get so caught up in this pre-performance contemplation and trying to get ourselves to think or feel something so that we can then perform. And I think it's understandable, but it's a mistake. There's a Japanese psychiatrist named Shomo Morita, lived about 100 years ago, and a lot of this thinking is influenced by his work, and he would say we cannot directly control thoughts and feelings. We can influence thoughts and feelings indirectly through action. That when we identify what it is we need to do and follow through with doing it, thoughts and feelings then seem to follow the lead of action and are put into appropriate context. But too often, again, we try to think and feel a certain way before we perform. It's backwards. These were his 3 basic tenets, and he called this coexistence with feelings. Accept your thoughts and feelings as they are. Know your purpose. Do what needs to be done. So when I was working with the kicker and he was very nervous, I would just say to him over and over again, you're not responsible for what you think or feel. You're responsible for executing your progression. What's your progression? The first time I met with him on the field, they said, show me your progression. I was a basketball player. I was a very good free throw shooter, shot over 90%. And every time I got up, I found the mark on the floor, put my right foot on it because I'm right-handed. It's the center of the basket. Ref would throw me the ball. 1, 2, 3, set, shoot. When you do the same thing procedurally every time, it's total embodied doing. I don't need to think. That posterior cingulate cortex doesn't need to be involved. And I can do that without hesitation. It can be in practice. It can be with 1 second left in a game. It can be with 1,000 people watching. It can be with no one watching. It doesn't matter. Why? Because all that's within my control is my progression. Get the ball, 1, 2, 3, set, shoot, without hesitation. And so working with him, he had a very successful season. Went from not starting to being all conference. A lot of that, all of it, basically, is his hard work. But reframing, coming up with a progression. Sorry, I got on a tangent. When I said to him the first time, what's your progression? He goes, what do you mean? I said, well, what do you do before you kick? So I don't know. I just kind of like take a couple steps, and then I go over here. I'm like, whoa. No. You need to do the same thing every time so that you could kick a field goal with your eyes closed. And he's like, oh, okay. And so then he just started meticulously practicing. I said, do it without a ball. Start without a ball. Right? And so it's narrowing your focus onto the things that are immediately within your control, and then executing those things with perfection and letting your thoughts and feelings be what they will be. Morita, one of the things he really focused on, 5 minutes? Sorry. One of the things he really focused on was public speaking. A lot of people were very anxious about public speaking, and he would say to someone, don't think you need to get over your anxiety of public speaking in order to speak publicly. Just go speak. Coexist with your anxiety. Let it be what it is. Do what needs doing. What's your purpose? It's to get up there and communicate something. Well, what are you communicating? Focus on that. So it's a powerful shift. These are some of his quotes. They're wonderful. Trying to control the emotional self is like trying to choose a number on a thrown die or to push the water of a river back upstream. The answer lies in practicing and mastering an attitude of being in touch with the outside world. This is called a reality-oriented attitude, which means, in short, liberation from self-centeredness. Most of your thinking and feeling revolves around you, your anxieties, your hopes, what happens when you make the field goal, what's going to happen if you miss the field goal, or whatever it is. In short, spend less time and attention on trying to fix yourself and fix your feelings, and just spend more time attending to and paying attention to living and performing and what's within your control. And last, I say this to students and people I work with all the time, the average person is awake about 16 hours a day. 1% of 16 hours is 10 minutes, roughly. commit to 1%. 10 minutes a day, practice attention. Practice sitting down and becoming acclimated to what's the inner architecture of your world, right? What are these basic archetypal thought patterns that are running in the background, that are like your software? Become familiar with them. Start to identify how generously you give attention to them, and then as a result, you feel them emotionally as if they're true. It's like virtual reality. And then when you feel them emotionally, you embody them, you go and you act as if that is truth. And so you get this unquestioned progression between thinking, feeling, and action. And so take 10 minutes a day to become acclimated with this automaticity. And mindfulness is a wonderful practice for interrupting that process so that there's some choice there. So you can say to yourself, is that thought actually true? Well, if it's not, then why am I allowing myself to feel this way in relation to it? And return your attention back to the present moment. And in short, the big punchline, well-being and performance are not separate. And we often think that we can push performance and grind it out and worry about our well-being later. And that's just simply, it's not true and it's not sustainable. That really to focus on well-being is to focus on the most important performance, which is the performance of your life. Day-to-day living, the person you are. And then if there's, in addition to that, a specific type of performance that's very meaningful to you, then your well-being is central to being able to enter into that peak performance state. That's it. Feel free to visit my website, send me an email if you have questions, concerns.